November 2nd, 1943, 22,000 feet above Rabaul, New Britain. The air is thin and bitter, vibrating with the scream of engines pushed beyond comfort. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, tightens his gloved hand around the control stick as his A6M Zero claws upward through broken cloud. Below him, the harbor burns. Oil tanks are already aflame, black smoke boiling skyward like a signal flare to every pilot still alive. Tanaka has flown this route dozens of times. He knows the silhouettes that belong in this sky. He knows their speeds, their habits, their weaknesses. Then he sees them. Silver shapes cut through the cloud deck above him, high, fast, wrong, not the lumbering bombers from last year. Not the sluggish fighters he once outturned with ease. These aircraft descend with discipline, wings tight, engines roaring with a deeper, angrier sound. As they pass, sunlight flashes off smooth metal skin, unpainted, unapologetic. Tanaka's mouth goes dry. "New types," someone crackles over the radio. The voice is tense, older, a veteran of China, maybe. "Climb carefully." Too late. The American fighters drop through the clouds like stones. They do not turn to engage. They dive straight through the formation, guns already firing, then pull away, upward, back into the sun. Tanaka jerks his Zero into a climb, instinct screaming at him to follow. The engine protests immediately. His aircraft shudders as the American fighter, thicker wings, squared-off tail, pulls away, climbing faster than anything Tanaka has ever chased. He pushes the throttle to its limit. The Zero responds with vibration and heat, not speed. That should not be possible. A year ago, Tanaka would have laughed at this machine. In 1942, American fighters were clumsy, underpowered, easy prey. Japanese pilots wrote home about them with casual arrogance. "They fly like trucks," Tanaka once joked in a mess hall, thick with cigarette smoke and victory. Now the truck is climbing away from him. Another pass. This time, the Americans fire from farther out. Accurate bursts that stitch the air around Tanaka's wing. He rolls hard, bleeding speed, trying to force a turning fight. Still, no one follows him down. They don't need to. As he levels out, Tanaka sees one of his wingmen erupt into flame. The Zero disintegrates in midair, fuel tank igniting like paper. No prolonged dogfight, no dramatic spiral. Just gone. The radio fills with confusion. "They're faster than yesterday. Since when do they dive like that?" "What engine is that?" Tanaka doesn't answer. His eyes are locked on the sky ahead, searching for familiar shapes that no longer exist. The Americans are flying something new again. Stronger engines, heavier guns, faster climbs. And this is not the terrifying part. The terrifying part is the realization forming in Tanaka's mind as he throttles back. Engine overheating, fuel running low. It is November. And the Americans are already flying planes that feel like they belong to next year. As smoke trails and shredded metal fell back toward the burning harbor, above the Pacific, an entirely different kind of fire was burning between rival aircraft designs, one that would decide the future of the sky. By late 1943, the Japanese Zero, once the terror of early Pacific battles, was increasingly a relic of the pre-war mindset of dogfighting and agility. Its strengths were real, excellent maneuverability and extraordinary range early in the war, but as the conflict dragged on, its weaknesses became deadly liabilities. It lacked pilot armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, making even a grazing burst from enemy fire fatal. Across the ocean, American engineers and pilots were rewriting aerial combat. On board the USS Essex in January 1943, pilots of F6F Hellcats felt the difference the moment they throttled up. These fighters were born not to mimic the nimble Wildcats of 1941, but to obliterate them. Powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, they delivered explosive power, far surpassing the older engines found on Japanese designs. The result was a dramatic increase in top speed, climb rate, and the ability to fight at higher altitudes. Lieutenant Samuel "Red" Jennings, standing on the Essex deck, remembered the first test climb. "The engine roared like a beast unleashed," he later would recall. We pulled up through the clouds with more power than any American fighter we had before. Those who flew Hellcats with him said they felt invincible compared to earlier Wildcats, built tougher, flying faster and hit harder. The Hellcat 650 caliber Browning machine guns weren't just there for show. They could spray sustained bursts across the wings of an enemy without overheating. Japanese fighters, still often armed with lighter guns optimized for tight-turning dogfights, could often only hope to survive long enough to evade. By mid-1944, stories filtered back from engagements over the Marianas and the Philippines of American fighters outpacing and outlasting Japanese planes in the skies. These weren't isolated encounters, they were becoming routine. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American pilots tallied overwhelming victories against Japanese air forces. In engagements nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot because of how quickly Japanese aircraft were sent down. Even other American fighters were contributing to the shift. Pilots flying F-4U Corsairs, known for their inverted gull wings and visceral acceleration, replaced Zeros in close combat and long-range strikes alike. Meanwhile, twin-engine P-38 Lightnings escorted bombers across vast expanses of Pacific Sea, smashing interceptors before they could close in. Japanese pilots like those under Saburo Sakai began to speak less of the Zero's graceful handling and more of its obsolescence. In June 1944, Sakai encountered a formation of Hellcats and barely escaped alive, fighting not only the enemy pilots, but the performance gap that now defined the aircraft themselves. For veteran Japanese flyers, this was the darkest realization of all. They had once dominated the skies with tactical finesse and a plane that danced with the wind. But against the relentless rate of American technological improvement, new engines, heavier firepower, greater payloads, and sturdier armor, their beloved Zero was no longer king. And in the skies above the Pacific, every dogfight now carried more than life and death. Those Japanese fighters that once danced on the wind, intimidating every Allied pilot who saw them in 1941 to 42, now found themselves facing machines crafted for raw performance and sustained combat superiority. What Tanaka and his squadron encountered above Rabaul was not an isolated quirk of battle. It was the result of systematic American aircraft development that accelerated throughout 1943 and into 1944. From the decks of the newly commissioned Essex-class carriers, like USS Essex and USS Yorktown, squadrons of F6F Hellcats began to pour into the Pacific War, designed not just to replace aging Wildcats, but to decisively outclass the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. The Hellcat brought overwhelming advantages in speed, power, climb rate, armor, and firepower. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double-wasp radial engine gave it roughly 2,000 horsepower, far beyond what Japanese fighters could muster at scale at that point in the war. Pilots quickly learned that the Hellcat wasn't merely a match for the Zero. It was superior in virtually every major fight parameter. It could reach higher speeds, operate effectively at greater altitudes, and accept hits that would have doomed a Zero outright. Self-sealing fuel tanks and armor plating around the cockpit increased pilot survivability, making each engagement less of a gamble. Lieutenant Charles "Chuck" McCampbell, flying with VF-15 aboard Essex, experienced this firsthand on a single mission in late October 1944. McCampbell and his wingmen shot down 15 enemy aircraft, with McCampbell himself credited with 9 kills, most of them Zeros. That day, American fighters ensured that none of the Japanese bombers even reached their targets. Historians later dubbed Hellcats the Zero Killers, precisely for performances like this. The tactical doctrine also evolved alongside hardware, where earlier US fighters like the F-4F Wildcat had to rely on clever maneuvers and tight-turning battles, often their only hope against the Zero's agility. Hellcat pilots now had the luxury of dictating engagement conditions. They could climb above, dive through, or simply outrun the enemy as needed, exploiting their superior performance envelope. This technological and tactical edge culminated in June 1944's Battle of the Philippine Sea, where American pilots racked up overwhelming victories in what came to be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. During this battle, the disparity in aircraft performance and pilot training became painfully obvious. Inexperienced Japanese aviators flying aging designs were torn apart by superior American machines and better prepared crews. But beyond hardware and tactics, the psychological impact was profound. We're forced to reckon with the reality that the Allies, not Japan, were now defining the pace of aerial evolution. For someone like Tanaka, who learned to fly when dogfighting finesse and lightweight design ruled the Pacific skies, this shift was more than technical. It was disorienting. Because what he was now up against wasn't just better aircraft, it was an entire industrial and technological machine that refused to be outpaced. Over the rolling blue of the Pacific, technological evolution was as much a weapon as every bullet and bomb dropped. Japanese pilots like Tanaka were discovering this lesson the hard way, not through textbooks, but through the violent orchestration of steel and fire in the skies. The Grumman F6F Hellcat wasn't simply an upgrade. It was a deliberate answer to the Zero. Designed from the outset to outmatch Japan's infamous fighter, the Hellcat combined superior engine power, armor, and firepower into a balanced, agile machine that could dominate aerial combat. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double-wasp radial engine delivered around 2,000 horsepower, significantly more than the lighter engines in Japanese fighters, enabling the Hellcat to reach higher speeds and climb faster. By September 1943, the Hellcat entered frontline service aboard USS Yorktown and other carriers of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Early engagements proved its promise. Quick climbs, devastating 650 caliber machine gun volleys, and the toughness to return home even badly wounded. Lieutenant Robert W. Duncan was among the first to prove its might. On October 5, 1943, Duncan became one of the first Hellcat aces by shooting down a Japanese Mitsubishi A6M Zero, the very plane that had once symbolized Japanese air superiority. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. A Hellcat climbing relentlessly, its robust frame shrugging off what would have crippled a Zero, and Tanaka's beloved fighter struggling to keep pace. As 1944 dawned, the Hellcat's dominance only increased. In aerial engagements like the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American pilots in Hellcats accounted for the vast majority of Allied air victories. During this battle, mockingly dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Hellcats, along with Corsairs and other fighters, decimated Japanese aircraft formations, often before they could even fully engage. For pilots like Tanaka, these battles were profound shocks. They weren't merely losing duels in the sky. They were discovering that America's industrial and technological advantage translated directly into ever better aerial weaponry. Year after year, machines that were faster, stronger, and ready in far greater numbers than anything Japan's aviation industry could counter. Japanese engineers had continued to refine existing aircraft and even developed new models. But resource shortages, production bottlenecks, and pilot attrition severely limited their impact. As the sky above the Pacific oscillated with tracer fire and smoke trails, the gulf between Japanese and American aircraft design philosophy became unmistakably clear, not just in isolated encounters, but in battle after battle where performance, production, and pilot survival all bent toward the Allies' advantage. By late 1943, Japanese pilots were encountering a new reality. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, which had once reigned supreme early in the Pacific War, was now facing opponents that could outpace and outgun it in most scenarios. Enter the Grumman F6F Hellcat, developed specifically to counter the Zero's strengths and exploit its weaknesses. Powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double-wasp engine producing around 2,000 horsepower, the Hellcat boasted a higher top speed and better dive performance than the Zero, while reinforced armor and self-sealing fuel tanks greatly improved pilot survivability. Unlike the lightweight, nimble Zero, which sacrificed armor to achieve long range and agility, the Hellcat was a rugged and powerful fighter designed for the brutal conditions of carrier operations. Its 650 caliber machine guns packed a devastating punch at combat ranges, allowing pilots to inflict significant damage without needing to close to dangerously short distances. Advanced radar and tactics, including the thatch weave, further neutralized whatever dogfighting edge the Zero once held. The impact was staggering. Over the course of the war, Hellcat pilots flew tens of thousands of combat sorties and were credited with destroying more than 5,000 enemy aircraft, a staggering contribution. That accounted for roughly 75% of all U.S. Navy air victories in the Pacific. Even when fought one-on-one with Zeros alone, the Hellcat's kill ratio was roughly 13-1, reflecting both the plane's superior performance and the broader decline in experienced Japanese aviators. Battles like the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 starkly illustrated this shift. Japanese carrier air wings were decimated with astonishing losses, so lopsided that American pilots dubbed the engagement the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Hellcats and other U.S. fighters swooped from altitude with devastating firepower, dictating engagement conditions and minimizing their own risk. A far cry from earlier fights where Allied pilots struggled to engage the Zero on equal terms. For pilots like Lieutenant Tanaka, the implications were personal and brutal. What had once been an adversary respected and even feared was now a machine that consistently outperformed Japanese designs in every key metric. Engineers in Tokyo worked tirelessly on upgraded Japanese fighters, but chronic shortages of materials, industrial bottlenecks, and pilot attrition meant that these efforts came too late, too fragmented, and too few. By the summer of 1944, seasoned Zeppelin-era pilots found themselves facing a sobering truth. The aircraft they once chased with agility and confidence were no longer the apex predators of the sky. They were losing altitude, momentum, and increasingly, lives to machines built not just for combat, but for sustained superiority. And with each new Hellcat that roared off a carrier deck into the Pacific dawn, that superiority only deepened.